Right. Hello, we are live. So had a little bit of a technical difficulty when actually setting up the stream, so we'll just wait to rack the numbers back up. Yeah, in the meantime, how's everyone's evening going? Mornings, days, whatever your local uh, time measurement is right now.
I'm doing fine for the most part. Woke up a little bit sick, but I seem to be doing better now.
I don't know, is it COVID or?
It's been super cold the past few days, so I think I just caught a cold.
Ah, fair enough. Hopefully nothing too serious or anything. Well, this technical difficulty has been a little annoying. Seeing as we had 8 people waiting on the other stream, and now we have 4. So I'm hoping that
You
we
could
haven't lost too
you
many
could
people.
try like changing the title and stuff of the old one. Maybe that like
Or don't
helps.
use this stream. This stream is dead.
Yeah, I guess.
Does it only update when
Good
you
idea.
refresh the page?
Old link. Read comments. Okay. Well. I've updated the other one. Let's give it a couple of minutes and then we'll just have to go with it. But yeah, Kai, how's your day been?
My day's been great. I mean, I have holidays now, so obviously I'm very happy.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'm very jealous of everyone who took leave this week, seeing as it's the half-term holidays here as well. But I didn't take it as leave, so I've just been working.
Yeah, I mean, school's nice in that way.
Well, yeah, and that you get a ridiculous amount of holidays, or at least compared to what you would otherwise get.
Yeah, for sure. Right. So you want to like give it a few minutes, or like are you?
I think we're just gonna have to roll with it. To be honest, I'm not seeing the numbers haven't flickered in a while, so we're just gonna have to go with it. So hi, welcome everyone to the community stream, the community meeting. I am Dylan or Perksy. I am one of the maintainers on Silk. I'm joined by Kai and Thomas, who are other maintainers, and then some community contributors, Tanner and Bailey, who have joined us. We've got a number of community contributors that tend to pop in on these meetings, but at the same time, just because you can't use your human voice doesn't mean that you can't talk to us in the chat. We are looking at the YouTube chat for feedback, and at the same time, if you're watching this on demand, you can send us feedback over at GitHub in our Discord server. Or just we have a Twitter now, so you can use our Twitter. Yeah, just send us whatever feedback you have wherever you can send it, and we shall read it and mull over it. But yeah, so the main point of us doing this meeting is because we want to gather all the feedback we can for the new version of Silk.net. Because at the moment we are currently designing a rewrite. We haven't actually started implementing it yet, but we are designing it. We've written up the designs, and we want to make sure that the community sort of agrees with them before we actually go ahead and implement them. Because, well, if we implement something that you all disagree with, then not only have we made the community mad, we've also wasted our time and sort of have to. We just want to build the best library we possibly can, and yeah, we look forward to what feedback you have, and hopefully, if all goes to plan, our designs are sort of favorable, and we can start implementing this thing. So yeah, this is sort of the start of a new a new age, if you like, of Silk.net. I know that sounds really cringy, but yeah, it's a new phase, and yeah. So we've got a number of designs and another documents to review. If I switch over to my screen, so this first document we've got, it sort of goes over what we're trying to do with this new rewrite. It's Silk.net 3.0. It is a major version, so there will be breaking changes. But yeah, all of these documents are linked in the description, so you can have a read with them. At the same time, you can just look at the stream as well. For the people in Discord, it's probably best on bandwidth if I don't share my screen in Discord as well. So you're just gonna have to follow along with the stream and appreciate the delay. I think it's around 2 seconds in our initial testing. So yeah, so this is Silk.net 3.0 is something that's been building across the entirety of the development of the current version of Silk.net. Is that while we thought Silk.net 2.0 was, it sort of gave us everything we needed, we realised we were carrying around a lot of cruft from the older version of Silk.net, because the code base hasn't really significantly changed since it was created 3 years ago, and I know 3 years is a relatively short time. It's in the vast scheme of things, because of how fast Silk.net moves, it's a perfectly short amount of time to gather lots of tech debt and just loads of questionable things, and we've over time we've sort of realized we could do things a lot better, and especially with all the changes happening in .NET at the moment, we definitely wanted to design something that accounted for the changing landscape. So this is the goal of 3.0 really. So first of all, this is a departure from 2.x. We are using .NET 6 exclusively, seeing as you can target all of the platforms like mobile and desktop from .NET 6, rather than the previous model where you had .NET Core, you had Xamarin and all the other stuff. So we don't really need to support those older frameworks anymore. We can just use one target framework, and there's a bunch of new stuff as well, so we don't have to have loads of horrible if-defs in the code, which we have to do at the moment to sort of make things faster on the new platforms and all that stuff. So that's one of our main goals, is we just want to use .NET 6 to simplify things, as well as sort of move with the changing landscape of .NET. I should probably add, if you have any questions on any of the stuff that we're talking about, just drop them in the chat whenever, and we'll pick them up as we're going through, or failing that, we'll just pick them up at the very end. So the second goal is that we want to sort of design the API so it's more easily integrated with other systems, because I know one of the biggest feature requests so far has been WinForms and WPF, among a lot of other UI frameworks, and our current APIs, they're sort of designed to be standalone. They don't really fit into other frameworks very well. So the new API we've designed, it can be as bare bones as you want it, or it can be as standalone as you want it, and it should, in theory, just give you an object that can either represent a standalone window or something integrated in with your UI, and you can just pass that around to your code as you see fit. We will discuss that further, as that does have its own proposal. We'll discuss that next, actually, after this one. So we've sort of covered that, the windowing rewrite. Now, a lot of one of the most painful points in 2.x has been the bindings generator. Now, this was something that was quickly whipped together in the early Silk days to quickly get some bindings going, and it worked well for OpenGL because that's the main thing it was designed for. But then we started duct taping lots of other stuff like Vulkan, like OpenCL, and loads of other APIs on top of it, and it sort of became an unmaintainable mess near the end. And then with Silk.net 2.0, when we were supporting DirectX as well as a whole load of other libraries as well, it wasn't well designed. We never gave it much thought. We just sort of tried to shove everything through the same pipelines as we always have been. So yeah, we figured we should take a step back. And well, we design something that is usable outside of Silk.net. Because well, while it's a mess internally, it is a good generator, and we want other users to be able to use it. Whereas right now, it's very much tailored towards our needs. And B, we just wanted to make it more maintainable for us, as well as give it a bit more thought, and hopefully, amongst all of that, make it a lot easier to contribute to as well. Because while it's all well and good, us maintaining our bindings, like there's a vast community who might have ideas for bindings that we're not prepared to support, and at the same time, the community might want to tinker with a generator and whatnot. And also, instead of duct taping lots and lots of code onto our existing generator, we figured we would use Clang Sharp or Clang Sharp, or whatever you prefer to pronounce it. I'm pretty sure Tanner will say that it's pronounced Clang Sharp. For those of you who aren't familiar, Tanner is the maintainer of Clang Sharp. So yeah, we're good.
It's Clang Sharp. That's the official name and pronunciation from the Clang team.
Okay. So yes, Clang Sharp, which is very mature and generates the popular TerraFX library, which is a more low-level library than Silk, for bindings to Windows, I believe Vulkan as well, and a bunch of others. But it is more low-level than what we're targeting. So what we're sort of hoping with this proposal is that we can have a solid base that both TerraFX and Silk.net are using, and sort of build from that base our own sort of style, because Silk.net will always be a bit more C-sharpy than the base material, whereas TerraFX is sort of exposing the it's sort of as bare bones as possible, so you can just sort of copy and paste almost C code, and it be pretty close to what it is when it's put in C-sharp.
So I just wanted to quickly say, FrenzyBite asked in the chat whether with .NET 6 and MAUI around, we'd be happy to support the metal backend, and I believe we'll be happy to have MAUI do whatever they want, but we are not planning to add any metal backends in 3.0 right now, so
not right now, no. It's certainly something that's in demand, and it's something that we would look at expanding our generator support, but right now there's no support for it in Clang Sharp, although I know a community contributor is working on it. So maybe that will feed up to our bindings, but right now there's no immediate plans for metal bindings, but it is one of the sort of lower priority items that has been asked for a lot, and well, you never know is what we're trying to say, but it's not in official plans right now. So yeah, it might happen. You just have to see how things go, I guess. So yeah, another point of this is we want to make our mass library a lot faster, so that I know there's a number of JIT changes happening to sort of make it happen at that layer. But at the same time, we also wanted to use intrinsics and sort of expose our own abstraction layer on top of the various system-specific instructions. So that proposal we've already reviewed, and it's currently being developed against 2.x. However, it might be, depending how long development takes, that we just move this into 3.0 straight away. That's primarily being championed by a community contributor at the moment, so we'll have to see how that goes. Oh, that's interesting. I forgot to turn my notifications off. Let me do that. Actually, no, let's not do that because that will show all my notifications. So yeah, we've already reviewed that. We're not going to go over it again. However, that link is in that document if you wanted to have a look at it. And then
Just pointing out that proposal in the discussion we had about that proposal, we also came to the conclusion that we should have approximate functions and exact functions, and that'll also be implemented in the 3.0 eventually.
Yeah, I don't remember where we put the notes for that. I think it was fairly recent, actually, in a different pull request.
I think it's on the issue.
Is it? Okay. Oh wait, hang on. SIMD revision is that? Ah, yeah, here it is. So the meeting notes are on pull request 690. If you're interested in that. I've just seen a question in the chat from Matt. Does Molten VK already work anyway with Silk? Yes. I can't say we've tested it, but in theory, all the support is there, so it just needs someone to give it a go, essentially. But yes, Molten VK is a target for Silk.net already, and if it doesn't work, then that's something we need to fix. But yeah, it should work fine. So yeah, in this document, you've sort of outlined the development roadmap. Now, I'm not going to go through every point here. You can give the document of links a read, but we're following the same 5 preview model that we've done in the past for 2.x and 1.x. Is that preview 1 sort of like is finding our feet? It's very experimental preview. Preview 2 is a bit more solid. We're sort of shaping the library a lot more. Preview 3 almost there, but we've just got a lot of behind the scenes work to do. Well, maybe some things will change. I don't know, but it's getting close to the end product. And then preview 4 is what we start suggesting. Hey, you should start moving your applications to this. This is getting pretty close to, well, it is production ready. It's what we class as production ready. It is probably at that point, depending on how things go, that we might stop 2.x updates, because I know we did that at 2.0 development as well, as we stopped updating 1.x once we had a production ready preview. And then preview 5, it should be literally just bug fixes, almost ready to release. So it's at that point that if you haven't moved over to 3.0, well, you're either targeting a target framework that's out support anyway, such as .NET Framework or Xamarin, or you just haven't moved over yet, which you really should at that point, because 3.0 is the future of Silk.net. So there's a number of problems that we came across in 2.x. Again, I'm not going to go through every single point on how we're resolving them, but one of the biggest complaints is documentation. So in development of this, we're going to take a much stricter stance on documenting. Is that at the very least, the implementation of everything should be documented, so some user documentation could be extrapolated from that, and in addition, the community is more likely to contribute because they actually understand what we've written, whereas right now the Silk.net code base is a bit of a mess, and unless you're in our Discord, which to be fair is a perfectly acceptable resource, we're sadly pretty much always active in there. We should probably find something better to do with our time, but no, we're always there. So yeah, you can always talk to us for finding your feet in our code base, but really that's the only resource we have for contributing at the moment. There isn't a lot of planning, we've sort of just gone with it. So we're being a lot stricter with our proposals as well, to get the community feedback, and we're going to do these community meetings regularly as well. Not at a fixed interval, it's just when we're going to try and say, if we've got some questions, we'll do a community meeting and start tackling through the questions or whatever. And it's sort of alluded to in the later proposal, like the Silk Touch proposal, that we're just going to try things out, and then depending on how our experiments go, we will feed back to the community in these community meetings. and see what we want really. The barrier to entry for external contributors, again, we're trying to solve this with documentation as well, and our level correctness is inconsistent. So the Silk Touch rewrite, which we're going to touch on later, which uses Clang Sharp, our correctness should go immediately up, seeing as those bindings are a lot more proven than our sort of duct tape generator. So yeah, all in all, Silk.net should be getting a lot more stable and a lot more documented. So this sort of describes how we're going to lay out the documentation in the actual repo. I don't think there's much of interest there, and it sort of says how we're going to document it. So the idea is that we have 4 contributors and then we have user documentation as well. So we're catering for both. Most of this, I presume, is unobjectionable, but if somehow you do have an objection, please put it in the chat or raise your voice. So yeah, and we're going to be continuing the monthly updates that we do for 2.x at the moment, because I think Silk.net has proven to work, but at the same time, the libraries that we bind to, they change all the time. So we should probably keep up to date. We're going to keep up the first Friday of the month schedule that we do for our updates. Only now we've got an official policy for emergency patches. So if we sort, as maintainers, if we have if we see a massive problem, we're not just going to leave it there for a whole month. We are going to sort of up the patch version and release a patch, because, well, we don't want to have everyone using a broken version for a whole month just because, oh, we're sticking to the schedule. So yeah, and for the versioning, everything before Silk 4.0 will just be a minor version update if it's not an emergency patch, because it's just simpler, seeing as we regenerate the bindings every time, and that's probably going to introduce some changes which constitute a minor version upgrade anyway. So it's just safer to just keep upping a minor version, and it's easy to follow as well. So breaking changes, we've also got an official breaking change policy now, which we didn't before. We've left it vague to say if there's an API that's causing a lot of problems in the community, we reserve the right to remove it, which has been a problem in the past. We've had some APIs which everyone in the community just didn't know how to use. Or, well, technically it didn't work, I think. So yeah, we decided to yank it out, but it took us too long because we weren't sure, well, should we remove it? It might cause breaking changes for someone using it. So yeah, we decided to formalize it that if it's causing a lot of disruption, we're just going to yank it out. And if you've somehow made something work out of that extremely problematic API, first of all, I doubt your code is very pretty, so I would love to see that. But yeah, second of all, yeah, problematic APIs, even if they work somehow, it's just generally not worth it for the community. And finally, we've said that API breaks might be allowed depending on the circumstances, but this is only because all of the Silk.net versions are usually kept in sync anyway. So every Silk.net package will be on the same major or minor version. So in theory, as long as it's not source breaking, having an API break isn't too harmful. And then finally, we're sticking with the same schedule as before, whereas as soon as we release a new minor update, the old minor version goes out of support immediately as far as the Silk.net team are concerned, unless any one of the individual maintainers want to provide their own support, like via a GitHub sponsors benefit or whatever. So this is the end of the first document, sort of outlining what we will be doing in 3.0. It's a relatively simple document. This is just sort of like the easy bit, but if there's any questions, we'd love to hear them on what we're planning for 3.0, and if not, we shall move on. And I shall be writing some notes as well, just in case there are any questions. or any thoughts about what we should be doing in 3.0 and what isn't there. Because we've mentioned that WPF, WinForms, Maui, and Avalonia are currently our priorities for UI libraries. But if there's anything else that you're interested in, we'd love to put it on the list. And likewise, if there's any bindings that you're interested in, we'd love to hear what you think.
What about edo.forms, or is that not really supported, or planning to be supported due to it being multi-backend?
It honestly depends how it's implemented, because I think if we could get an easy way to create an OpenGL context in there, or get a window handle, I think that's really that's really all you need to make it to implement our windowing library. So in theory, it could be done. Whether we will officially support that, like from a first party perspective, I don't know. Because I think our workload here is big enough as it is. However, if someone were to put in a pull request support the eto.forms, we probably would support it. So it doesn't strike me as the most popular UI library. I mean, I know there's a use case for it, and there is a small user base for it. But we've sort of tried to cover the most requested UI libraries at the moment, whereas I don't think I've seen a request for eto.forms at the moment.
Also pointing out that all of the already listed ones and also all other potential ones are primarily aimed at making a component or some equivalent that works. So it's not about controlling the whole VPF window. It's more about making like a VPF component that you can like embed and then use the context inside of.
To answer a question from the chat, yes. So yeah. So one of the things with this move to Clang is to sort of standardize our libraries and make it more correct. Our current generator, it's very much been bashed towards the shapes that we need it, and it's not really aimed to be like a general C++ bindings generator, unlike Clang, which is and has proven to work with a number of libraries. So as part of this consolidation, we will be we're hoping to make Silk Touch more portable by virtue of Clang being more portable. So yeah, I mean, we actually contributed XML support for Clang. So instead of outputting its bindings as C# code, we just output it as an XML tree that we can parse in our generator and then add our own modifications on top. So the groundwork is there to sort of use our own generator, and theoretically, there shouldn't be that much difference in terms of the actual signatures between what Clang generates and what we generate beyond our overloads and the usual silky goodness in our bindings. So we will go through that proposal later on, but hopefully that answers your question for the time being. Okay, so there being no objections, I am going to move on and sort of mark this as approved, if you all agree. Okay, well, I heard no objection, so I'm just going to put some notes on the pull request for future reference, just in case we want to revisit stuff like the eto.forms. It's good to know that we've discussed that for the future. Okay, so the next one, now we're actually reviewing some actual code, which is interesting. And we haven't lost our viewers yet, so that's good to know. We haven't bored you all. So this is sort of Kai's baby, so I will pass over to him at some point. So I should probably just first explain sort of what our windowing library is before I hand over to Kai to sort of go through what his problems with the current API were. So since the beginning of Silk.net, we've wanted to provide a sort of abstraction layer across windowing, seeing as it's a super fragmented space. I think on Linux alone there are 4 different ways to actually create a window, or four different APIs rather. And while our model is sort of to empower the user to do this all themselves and encourage the user to do this all themselves, I think for windowing it's a bit overkill, and the APIs are pretty much the same, unlike something like OpenGL and Vulkan and DirectX, which all have their different nuances. So since the beginning of Silk.net, we have provided a windowing abstraction over the various platform-specific window creation APIs. At the moment, this is just a wrapper over GLFW, which, well, in 2.x, it's a wrapper over GLFW and SDL, which take us to all the platforms that we want to support at the moment. In 3.0, this is likely to be GLFW, and if we want to support platforms beyond what GLFW supports, we will probably just use the bindings ourselves. Like on iOS, we'll use the existing Xamarin bindings to implement that support, and use the platform-specific APIs, seeing as the mobile space isn't really as fragmented. You have iOS and Android, and that's pretty much it. So so we've always provided a wrapper. However, this wrapper when we were designing this wrapper.
I see. I have the stream muted. So.
Are you? Okay. Well, so the stream, I didn't realize that. That's very strange. So for those of you who didn't, yeah, I was muted in the Discord for some reason, but the stream could sort of hear me. So hopefully you heard everything. Just 2 minutes behind. Thank you for letting me know. So yeah, as I was saying, our wrapper has sort of been designed to wrap over the platform-specific APIs via GLFW. However, when we were designing this one, we all came from OpenTK when we were originally starting Silk.net, so we just decided we should implement what OpenTK has implemented and expose that without really giving the API a second thought. In fact, I don't think there were any big review comments on the API for 1.x, whereas this one we're sort of having it's a common theme. We're having a step back and sort of giving it a proper look and figuring out what we could do better. And this is how the design has sort of come to light. So we wanted to really encourage write once, run everywhere, where currently in the 2.x API you have an I window and an I view. An I view is what you use on mobile, and an I window is what you use on desktop. And while you can technically write once, run everywhere solution, it's not clean. So we wanted to make it a bit tidier. So in this proposal, we've modernized the windowing library a bit in response to feedback, as well as to make it easier to have one bit of code that runs everywhere, on desktop, on mobile, on console, if we manage to get support through as well. So I'm going to hand over to Kai a little bit to sort of talk about his philosophy for the actual design, because this was sort of his brainchild, at least initially, and I just sort of did the hard work of documenting it. But yeah, the original iSurface, which is coined in this proposal, sort of came from Kai. So I shall hand over to you, Kai.
Right. So, yeah. I hope the surface is visible on stream when I'm saying this. Can't tell, but I hope so. So the surface is basically the new entry point to windowing. It's trying its best to kind of combine what's currently iView and what's currently iWindow to kind of an hopefully nice API that you can like work with. So I'll not go over like the platform support stuff. It's basically all of the platforms. So kind of just ignore that. And yeah, so first of all, we still have like a main static class that you use to acquire a service, but instead of having you always create one like it is right now with window, we just have get or create, and this is kind of like the most important part of this. You just ask for Silk to find something to draw to, and on a phone this will just be just the phone screen, and on Windows and macOS and Linux this will probably just be a new window, and this should be the standard use case. There is still APIs to facilitate like multi-window drawing on desktop, but that's not the main idea here. The main idea is to support the 99% of applications that create one window and just need some place to draw to, and this is what Surface is. So yeah, that's basically the core, that Surface is just something you draw to, and this should be implementable everywhere. In a window, it's the window. In a component in WPF, it's just the bit that WPF assigned to our component, and that's really simple. And then we make heavy use of more interfaces. The base interface is just really basic stuff. So you get the size. I think, yep, that's right. It's visible on the stream. You get size. You get to control how fast this runs. This should all be kind of familiar to someone already using Silk.net. It's all of the standard events and also standards stuff, but there's nothing advanced here. You can't. For example, you can't resize the window from this basic API because you can't do that everywhere. You can't resize a WPF component. You can't resize a phone screen. That's not something that's really possible. And so all of those kind of went away, and we really tried to keep the base interface easy and simple. And then we make lots of use of type checking. So for example, if you wanted to, if you wanted to do specific things on a desktop, you would try and see if the current surface you've been assigned implements iDesktop surface. That's kind of the other big API. And there, for example, we can see size is now assignable. You can now resize it. You can give the window a title. You can make it invisible. Lots of things you can only do on desktop and you can't do in any of the other places. And then there's a bunch of other interfaces. I'll just quickly go over the ones that are important here. There's 4 for GL and GLES, each 2, which expose some, GL-specific things. So they expose a handle, they expose whether the current GL context is current, they expose the swap interval, the bit depth, etc., which just doesn't exist on, like if you use DirectX, these options make no sense. So again, if you want to use GL, you check for this interface and you kind of use it. Right, then we also have the same for Vulkan. Again, very similar kind of style. If you want to use Vulkan, you check whether IVK service is implemented, and then you can try to enable it using the function, same as GL, and then you can use create to create the Vulkan surface. And it's very, very similar everywhere. For GL users, pretty much nothing has changed. It's just you now have to check whether the current surface supports GL. And for everyone else, it's just kind of got nicer because, for example, Vulkan, before you had a separate property, you had to like access, and that's not very nice. So now you just have exactly the same level of support as GL users had. Yeah, and then basically the last kind of new API is before we had a sort of not very widely known and not very widely used monitor API that's been replaced pretty much by iScreen. And iScreen, well, does everything you'd expect from a screen. It basically tells you the basic properties and allows you to modify the ones that are commonly modifiable. And I won't really go into depth here because it's not super important. yeah, I think basically all of these have existed on Silk.net 2 already. The only one that's also sort of new is iWindow handle source. This is kind of a niche feature, but just want to point out we still support you having access to the native handle of the window in case you ever need it. I hope you don't. I hope we provide all the things you could ever want, but if you ever need it, you can still use this. Right. So I think that's the basic overview, and
Is it worth talking about the gluer as well, as it's coined in this proposal?
right. I wasn't sure whether you want to talk about that or whether I should. However you wish.
I'll be willing to take it. It's fine. So in order to sort of facilitate a write once, run everywhere experience, obviously it's very different how you start up a application on desktop versus how you start up an application on Android or iOS. On desktop, it's as simple as just having a main function in a static class somewhere. Whereas on Android, it's a lot more complicated. You've got to have an activity. On iOS, it's also a lot more complicated. You've got to have an app delegate. So what this Silk entry point sort of covers is that you have you make a sort of like a main function, and then you just put Silk entry point on there, and then it'll automatically generate the most appropriate entry point mechanism for that platform. So on Android, it will generate an activity for you. On iOS, it will generate an app delegate for you. And on desktop, it will just generate a main function. The idea is that you sort of don't have to care about these differences. You just put a magical attribute on a function and it automatically generates the code for you. It sort of enhancing that write once, run everywhere experience. So hopefully that mostly covered that. I mean, I'm pretty sure these are all pretty sane restrictions. Like it has to be a static, it must return void, etc., etc. So it's essentially just a static function that we generate the guts for, and then we call into. It's worth noting you can put iDesktop Surface if you only want your application to run on desktop surfaces, or IGL Surface if you need a surface that uses OpenGL. You can just put that there, and it will automatically do the querying for you as well. So yeah, and it's worth noting that because of platform differences, this can technically be called multiple times, which isn't ideal because we know people don't really expect their main function to be called multiple times throughout the application. But there's some platform specifics, mainly on Android, that we can't really get around. So yeah, hopefully that covers that. Obviously, sorry.
Regarding Silk entry point, would there be a way to get things like launch parameters or launch options, whatever it's called?
So that's an excellent question. I'm not sure if is there an environment API for that. But if not, we should probably add one. Yeah, there's an environment.get command line args which can sort of do the same thing. Other than that, I'm not really sure what else we could need. I suppose one thing thinking about it now is, and Tanner can probably help me out here, is the com STA thread or MTA thread. I'm not sure how that works and how that's implemented in .NET. Hopefully we can just have it so when that Silk entry point function is called, you can just put an attribute there and it sort of work the same. But again, I don't know how it works, so that might be something thinking about. But in terms of command line arguments, you can just use the existing environment APIs. Hopefully you don't actually need the array that was passed in main.
You would need to propagate the STA attribute onto the actual main function, or if you're creating your own thread, make sure you set the apartment model before calling run.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Also, just really wanted to point out that the main reason for this design, I forgot to mention that, but the main reason for this design as opposed to the current design with booleans is that in a typical application, you'll have one like main like method or class that kind of figures out what's possible. And for example, selects which like API, which backend API it works on. And then everyone from there kind of expects this. So for example, your engine might see which kind of APIs are supported in which versions, and then selects one, and then everyone downstream basically, so they expects this. And usually we just kind of had this, we just expected it, and if something went wrong, just everything just kind of went up in flames. And using this design, this is basically ensured by type safety. So your methods that kind of require or expect Vulkan just take as a parameter IVK surface, and then there is no way to make it go wrong. It'll just sort of work by type safety. If you try to call it without checking, it'll just not compile, and that's kind of the main reason for this design over Booleans.
Oh, yeah, makes
So
sense.
for the issue of calling multiple times, is that due to the Android behavior of basically pause resume?
Yeah, basically, it's mainly down to how the actual Java runnables work with respect to that. Is that we found in our 2.x testing is that if you pause the application when you start it back up again, for some reason the main function was called again. It doesn't actually keep that runnable alive in the background, if you like. In some cases it does as well. So it's sort of inconsistent. So we sort of wanted to specify that, hey, this might be something that you want to care about.
Also, pausing is actually also handled by iSurface. So
yeah.
Just pausing and unpausing shouldn't really recall the main entry point, but other circumstances can.
Yeah, it's unfortunately a possibility. So we figured we'd mention it in the document just to be safe. Cool. Right, I shall keep an eye on the chat as that has disappeared with all my window moving around. Looks like we've got nothing in the chat, so I guess are there any questions from you? Any sort of like objections? I know this has changed a lot since 2.x, but is there anything that sort of strikes you in this proposal in the current version?
Is there you called out the ability to get the window handle. What about the other handle that you need for Vulkan and some other specialized scenarios?
Which handle do you mean?
So to create a surface, like a VK surface object, or do any kind of customization, you need both the window handle plus another handle, which in TerraFX I just call the context handle, which is the H instance or
it'll be the instance handle, and usually in Silk.net this is typed as instance or VK instance, and has an underlying handle field because we don't want to have the dependency here. It just takes a parameter and instance, so you'll just sort of have to unwrap the instance object from Vulkan.
No. This isn't the VK instance. This is, for example, the H instance from Windows, or it's the X display for xlib, for example. There's always two handles you end up passing to the two OS handles you pass to the Vulkan surface creation APIs.
Maybe I've forgotten about something here, but I'm pretty sure we already exposed this before. So this is basically what's all the way at the end at the proposal. It's just a window handle struct, and that should have everything you need. So like anything we have should be in there.
Well, we've sort of put a note there that we reserve the right to sort of put whatever handles that might be relevant to our implementations for that. So for well, you raised a very good point. For Win32, we probably want to put the H instance, the HDC, and the HWind in there, as well as on X11. I mean, for right now, on the current onset, is that this will probably be just basically a structs version of what we have in iNative window today. I shall put a link to that in the Discord, just so you can sort of follow along with that. But yeah, so for Win32 specifically, you have the HWind, the HDC, and the H instance. For X11, you have the display, the window. For Wayland, you have the display and the surface, etc. So it's open to interpretation. It's open to put whatever we want in there, whatever we deem relevant. For GLFW specifically, we actually only get the HWind, so we have to query the other pointers ourselves using get window long and get window long pointer and get DC, unfortunately. But yeah, so unlike 2.x, we can actually add more handles without breaking. So yeah, we will add whatever handles that are most reasonable for the user and what could be useful.
I've just noticed that we should probably change that type to be a class. I didn't notice before, but otherwise we might end up breaking someone's layout.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
And also, if there's lots of handles in there, there's not a reason to have it be a struct.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, part of this is I don't know what the official stance is from a .NET perspective on caring about memory layouts. I mean, obviously with our low-level library, it seems like the sort of thing we should care about, but I don't know. I mean, we could put a note on there, like should we sort of like the layout of this struct isn't guaranteed or whatever. I'm not sure, but yeah, we could change it to a class if we deem it being a problem. It's just I don't know whether we should consider it a problem.
You can also mark it as struct layout auto, and then it won't be marshalable across a P-invoke boundary, so people can't really depend on its layout.
Okay, that would be good. Just putting some notes.
Also, as a quick aside, so I don't forget, your P-invoke binding for get window long pointer is wrong. It's going to break on 32-bit.
So we recently had a pull request for that. Is that we've got a 32-bit version and a 64-bit version, which we use depending on what the bitness is. Yeah, we didn't really think that through, but it's fixed now, so yippee.
Okay, good.
Okay, just any more questions? Okay, doesn't look like there is anything else, so I'm just going to put some short notes. Actually, did we get around to reviewing this? No, we didn't. Okay, so we don't have anything, any notes from last meeting to review, whereas we reviewed input last time, as well.
So someone just asked. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So someone just asked whether the glue code in the startup is mandatory. I think they're asking whether you can also use the API without glue, so without the glue code, so without silk entry point. And yes, you can. You can just use the service type. There's a static service type, and you can just use that to acquire your service, and that should pretty much work the same.
Yeah, so the glue code is really just a wrapper around get or create, as well as generating the activity and the app delegate and whatnot. So it's sort of, well, it's called glue because it glues the native application model to the surface class and then passes control over to you once it's done all that. So yeah, it's not mandatory. You can use get or create new without the glue, but it's more a thing of encouraging write once, run everywhere, which is why this will probably be the recommended way to write a Silk application. But of course, there will be other ways to do it.
I think it's really useful if you're targeting cross-platform. However, if you're just going for one single platform, then it's probably not a very big struggle to not use it, but we'll still recommend it.
Yeah, I think if you're going for desktop platform, the easy way is to just use a normal main method, and then also immediately check whether your service is a desktop service, and if not, just close, I guess.
Yeah, and ultimately, if you use the glue model, for even if your application is desktop only on the onset, if you use the glue model, then you don't really need to worry about it's one less thing you need to worry about when you're porting to mobile, if you port to mobile. Yeah, you called that out. Yeah, so for the viewers' benefit, there's a weird bug with the Discord chat embed. Not to call Discord out or anything, but there's a weird bug with the embed where if you don't have a nickname, for some reason your name appears as object. So
Look,
yeah.
there is 3 question marks. That's very interesting.
we can't spend another half an hour trying to figure out Discord bugs like we did earlier on. Okay. Right.
Huh, weird.
Okay, so paste some notes in here again. Kai did raise a point that we should probably put them in the proposal itself, which we will do after this stream, just so you can read the proposal and everything be there. So if I post that, so yeah, unless there's any other objections, I think we should just move on and well, yeah, unless anyone has objections, I'm just going to mark this as approved. So, speak now. Okay, I shall do that then. So, what was next in the agenda? Input. So, this one I'm actually going to hand over to Thomas, who, while wasn't the main champion of the API, input is his area, and he had a lot of input, wink wink, in this input proposal. So, Thomas, if you could just sort of give us a run through. Hang on, I've got the 1.x input proposal open. So if I quickly switch over. Sorry about that. I mean, we could go back and review the original proposal from 3 years ago, but I'm guessing that's not what we want.
Yeah, I think it's better to look at the new one instead.
Yeah. All right, I've got the new one up now.
All right. So I want to start by looking at some of the problems or issues that we have with the current 2.0 input API. Actually, first of all, can you actually hear me correctly?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I just
Sounds
want to make sure I'm not talking to the wall. Sometimes it happens. Okay, so these are things that we might have found ourselves, but mostly they are thanks to your feedback, the community feedback. And we are very grateful for the people that take the time to communicate any issues without or help us improve the API. So let's get right to it. Some of the things that we have with the current 2.0 input API is lack of some more very specific functionality. In particularly, I remember stumbling upon not being able to detect key repeats on the key down event. You have no problem with that with key char, but if you're trying to detect, for example, key repeats on one of the arrow keys, then there's no way to do that. Something that the community has asked many times is about capturing state. It's not easy to capture state with the current proposal, with the current system. And there is an extension for this, but it's an extra package that you have to get, and it's not just trivial to copy the keyword state or something like that. So that's something we want to improve. There are also some differences in behavior between different backends in regards to, for example, when the events are actually raised, and we want to help with those because some people have been having issues. There are also some annoyances in the current API. For example, you have to code as if you could have multiple keywords or multiple mice, when in reality you would just have one of those, one keyboard and one mouse. So that's also something we wanted to make easier to use. I want to start then by looking not actually at the 3.0 proposal, but quickly glance over the enhanced input proposal that I wrote, when was this, at the beginning of 2021. This proposal is superseded by Perx's multi-backend input proposal, which is the one we'll actually be talking about. But the reason why I want to take a look at this proposal is to look at some of the things that we want to do to improve the issues I've been mentioning. So let's see. In particular, as I said, the key repeats, that is something that this proposal aims to fix, and other things are mainly usability. It's not as much of a functionality proposal as much as just making the API nicer to look at, easier to use overall. One of the things that this proposal introduced is the idea to, instead of having long parameter lists, which some of the events or methods on the current 2.0 proposal have long parameter lists, instead of doing that, we just put all those into a single struct. And this also allows us to, in the future, if we're missing something, we can just add it to the struct without that being a breaking change. We'll be utilizing read-only record structs in the current proposal. We are going to be taking a look at it later. And that should also be nice and performant. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention about the enhanced input proposal. Before I start talking about the new proposal, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about backends. So when we talk about a backend in Silk.net, we typically talk about one of the libraries Silk uses behind the scenes. You know, like if you're making a desktop project, you're probably using GLFW or SDL behind the scenes. But during the input section, we're going to be using the word backend to mean input backend. So basically that's an implementation of our input system over one of these libraries. I just want to make sure that people don't think, I don't know, GLFW is implementing these things for us or something like that. No, it's input backend means input backend during this section. All right, so without further ado, let's get to the new proposal. Let's read we have the design decision. This proposal, while aiming to give the same look and feel as the 2.0 proposal, is a complete redesign of the input API with the following goals. So we read some of the goals, so you'll see that it's mostly some redesigns and things that are aiming to fix the issues I was previously mentioning. One thing that we'll be talking a lot about is input contexts. So this pretty much is an object that replaces the current 2.0 input context, only that this time it's an actual object, not just an interface. It's a class. All input devices, regardless of what backend they come from, can be accessed from that central input context object. Initially, this proposal was purely state-based, and any event that had to be raised would be basically deducted from comparing the states. But this is not a nice way to handle things, because if you have something that changes fast enough, for example, the end user presses a button or clicks the mouse fast enough, then we will not be able to detect that, and no event will be raised. I'm gonna skip over the usage examples because it's supposed to mostly look like the 2.0 API. It's not supposed to look very different. While in the 2.0 API, we have the iDevice interface. Here we have, well, it's very similar, but instead of iDevice, we just call it iInputDevice to make it more clear. So yeah, we have the iInputDevice, and from that interface, we're going to get the iMouse, iKeyboard, and all the ones that you're probably used to if you've been working with the 2.0 API. Then we have the backends. We have the input backend. You can see it has similar properties with name, ID, and a list of devices. This is not just a separated per device, like you don't have keyboards, mice, no, they're just all together in a single list. And there is an update function. So this is one of the things that are changing in the current API. In the 2.0 API, information is updated as soon as it's available. For some people that has been working perfectly fine, but some people have been having issues because different platforms might do that at different moments. So in the 3.0 API, what we want to do is the information like device states, events, anything. Events are not raised and device states are not updated until you call the backend.update. One of the things you have to pass to the backend update is the input handler. We're going to be talking about input handlers more in a moment. One of the things I want to stress is how update works. The backend cannot just update all and then call events. No, things have to happen things have to be updated in the order in which they happen. So for example, if there was a mouse click, so first it's going to update. By mouse click I mean down and then up. First it's going to update the state of the mouse of the device that was pressed. For the button to be down, then it's going to raise the event. Well, raise it, it's going to report the event to the handler. If it implements the appropriate interfaces, we'll be talking about the handlers in a minute. And then it's going to update the state of the mouse again to be up. All right, so let's talk about the input handlers. So as we said, it's not good enough to just poll the states constantly to know which events have been happening. So this is going to be solved by the input handler model. So what you have to do is you have to implement, well, if you're using this API directly, if you're using an input context, this will be handled for you. And that will be the use case for the majority of our users. But for those people that want to use this API directly, what you would have to do is implement all the appropriate input handler interfaces that you want to be able to handle into an object, and each update to the backend, you'll have to pass that object as parameter. The idea of the input handlers is very simple. They just receive the events. Whenever an event occurs, the backend can report it to the input handler on the update function. Looking at the default input handler interface, you'll see that there's just a device connection changed event. You can also see that there is not a long parameter list in that event. It's just a single struct, a connection event, and everything is in there. As we talked in the enhanced proposals that got superseded by this one, yeah, we're doing that now. You can see it's quite simple. We have an example also about how the states have to be updated in order. Something that I also want to stress is that you cannot use different handler objects to update, to receive events on different objects. You have to implement all the interfaces you have in one class and make an instance of that one object. Because when you call update, any event that cannot be reported to the handler that was passed as parameter will be discarded. Also, if the handler is null, all events will be discarded. That's important. All right, let's talk about contexts.
Just to
So
jump in there, sorry, just to jump in there. The state will still update if you don't have an input backend as well. If you don't input handler, sorry, if you don't have an input handler and you pass in null, you will still be able to poll the state, for example. It's just this this input handler model is for the event driven stuff. If you decide to use the event driven model, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So most of the people are not going to be using that API directly. They'll be using the input context. That's going to be an API that's much more similar to what we currently have in 2.0, or that what most people are currently using in 2.0. If we look at the class for the input context, you'll see that basically you have a list, lists of different devices. So you have a list of mice, keyboards, gamepads, joysticks, and any device that does not go into those ones, just like in 2.0, it goes to another list of devices, just general things. One of the things that this proposal also introduces is multi-backend input. That's actually the name of the proposal. So you can have multiple input backends all going to the same input context. This allows if you're using multiple backends at the same time. Some people need to do that, some people don't. We're going to be supporting it. You can also add and remove backends at will. And when you call the input context.update, the only thing that will do is just call the update on all the backends. What else do we have? So let's talk about the list types. So as we said, if you remember, one of the issues I mentioned that we have with the current input system is what if you want to use input or mouse or keyboard input. Well, if you want to use the events, you have to subscribe to the iMouse or iKeyboard instance. However, the API is basically built around the idea that there might be multiple mice or keyboards, when in reality you'll just have one of those. And just to make sure we are on the same page, I want to clarify, if you plug in multiple keyboards to your Windows PC, you're not going to see multiple keyboards on the device list, because they still get reported as a single one. At the same time, a fancy backend could still implement the ability to differentiate those keyboards. That goes for the current 2.0 system and the 3.0. However, you will not have to worry about the keyboard changing, because now the events are all aggregated together per device. So you don't have to subscribe to the key down of each iKeyboard. You just have to go to the keyboards. So that's the list of keyboards, and you can subscribe to the key down. And whenever any keyboard raises has that event raised, it will go through that single event to you. This goes not just for keyboards, of course, it goes also for mice, it goes for gamepads, joysticks, and all of those devices that are aggregated into lists. What else? So there are other things that mainly, again, still remain similar to 2.0. For example, you can still configure how mouse clicks work. Remember that those things are not something that the backend brings. It's just us saying, all right, if you click and did not click again for this amount of time, then we raise the click event. If the mouse did not move enough in that period of time, also again, that also gets checked, and same for double click. Let's get to the devices then. All right, so I want to quickly go over the devices just to show what will be, how these interfaces will look. So as we said previously, one of the main issues that we have with the 2.0 system is that you cannot trivially capture state. Users have been asking for it, the extension package has been made, but still what we wanted to make in the 3.0 proposal is for state to be trivially capturable. So if you take a look at all of the devices, what you're going to see is that they all expose a single struct property called state, which contains the state of the device. And if there's anything else in the device, it's supposed to be things that you can set the device, but are not strictly related to the state of the device. So for example, you're not going to get whether a button is pressed or not exposed on the iMouse interface directly. It's going to be inside the iMouse.state. If we take a look at iMouse in particular, you can see that it has the mouse state property, which has information about whether each button is pressed or released, information about the position of the mouse on the screen, wheel position, the typical stuff you expect from a mouse state. And if you look at the other things you have in the iMouse interface, you have the cursor configuration and you have the set position. Now, something I want to mention, set position allows you to do, well, of course, set the position of the mouse. However, using set position will not immediately update mouse state. Why not? Because the state of the devices, or at least the state you can see on the devices, does not get updated until you call update. That does not mean, of course, that the position of the mouse does not get set until you call update. It gets set the moment you call set position. You will just not be able to see the updated position until you tell the backend to update the state. All right. If we take a look at the iMouse input handler as an example for an input handler, I do not want to go over every single handler, just one, for example. You can see basically, yeah, it's pretty simple. It inherits the input handler, so it already has the connection change, the status changed event, and it also exposes handle button down, handle button up, cursor move, and scroll. So those are basic mouse events. So that's basically what it does. If you have if when you update the backend, you pass an object that implements this interface, then you will be able to receive those events. What else do we have? Cursor configuration, we have some enums, keyboard input. Let's look at the keyboard input because we have some things to talk about here. So if we take a look at the iKeyboard interface, what you can see is there is a keyboard state property, just like in iMouse. There is a single state property which you can trivially copy. It's a read-only record struct. And then there are the extra things which are supposed to be not strictly related to the state. So what do we have? We have the clipboard text in case you want to be able to copy paste the things from the operating system, copy something from another application into your game. And then we have the begin input and end input. Anyone familiar with these functions in 2.0 will know that they are not required on desktop applications really, but we still encourage people to use them because we encourage people to write things in a way that's more more concise, and it would also make the application much easier to port in the future. So the idea is basically once you want your user to start typing, you call begin input. Once you don't want it to be able to type anymore, you call end input. What would this do? If you're on a phone, for example, then it would pull up the keyboard. Once you call end input, the keyboard will go down and your application will again have the entire screen for itself. So we had a bit of a discussion with how these things should work. If you look at the keyboard state, you will see that there's a property called text. So when you call begin input, keyboard state.text will begin populating. You will, as the characters are being typed by the end user, you will start seeing that list fill up with characters. And the moment you call end input, that property will be turned into null until the next begin input is called. You still have the key char event. We are still exposing that one if you wish to use that instead of having to handle the keyboard state text input with polling. So yeah, if you prefer to handle things the previous way, like we had before, you just have to use that event, then you can still do that. What else do we have? Keyboard input handler, not important. So let's quickly look at the gamepads.
We've just
So
before we do that, we've got a comment in the Discord chat. So for the mice and keyboard classes, are they basically the same as describing as subscribing to every mice or keyboard? I think that's referring to the
yeah,
input
that's the
handlers.
thing. The mouse and keyboard no longer have the events exposed on the iMouse or iKeyboard interface. If you want to use keyboard or mouse events for input, then you have to subscribe to the list. And if you're not using an input context, then you'll have to implement the iMouse input handler interface on an object, and you'll get the events from there. If your question is whether it's the same as subscribing to every mice and keyboard in the current 2.0, then yeah, that's basically what it does. But it's just much cleaner to do it this way. And yes, it handles updated, removed, and added devices.
Yeah, because one of the things we had in the 2.0 update is that well, you'd have to subscribe to, especially for gamepad input, you'd have to subscribe to every single gamepad for input, whereas some people don't really want that. So instead of having to subscribe to each device individually, you've just got one subscription, and then you can filter in that callback as you see fit.
Yeah, and also you don't have to worry about subscribing to the events, unsubscribing to the event. You just subscribe to this one event, and that lives as long as the input context does, basically. So, all right. I want to quickly look over the iGamepad interface. Again, it just inherits from iInput device. We have the gamepad state property. Not going to go over it because you've already seen the other states. And then we have a read-only list of motors. Again, these are the things that are not strictly related to the gamepad state or things that can be set. So you'll still have that list. You can still set the speed of the different motors. And if we go to the joystick input section, you'll see that it's again very similar story. Is there anything else somebody would like to ask?
Looks like we're all good from the YouTube chat, and at least at a glance in the Discord chat as well.
Right. Anything I missed? Anything you guys want to add?
So I
think
guess
it would be helpful.
sorry.
I was going to say, I think it would be helpful to see some code examples. Not necessarily today, since it'd probably be hard to type them up, but code examples showing scenarios like how would a user allow dynamically changing between the keyboard and mouse and a controller. Most modern games, for example, allow you to pick one up, and as soon as you start using a controller, it takes over the keyboard and allows you to start using the controller immediately. There's not an explicit like I have to go to settings and change my controls or anything like that. There's some games that even allow you to use both simultaneously, so you can like use a controller in one hand while using the mouse and keyboard with the other hand, and everything works as expected.
Yeah, Select does not really restrict you whether you have to do that one way or another, because you could just get the input or the state or the events from the devices, from the device list. You could do both of those things with Selk.
And then the other thing that wasn't clear to me is, say that you are playing a game and you're wanting to get updates in between frames, which is a fairly typical pattern. You just, you at the top of your loop, you call update to get new stateful information.
Yeah, you could
and
call
then
input context.update, and that would update the state and raise any event.
as part of that, you want to determine that, for example, space was hit twice. and whether or not another key was hit in between those two spaces. But you want to determine that space was hit exactly 2 times, and if there was any input between the two of them. Likewise, you may want to know if something was registered as part of the current frame or part of a previous frame. That way you can actually determine, like, the game is running at a very slow frame rate or a very fast frame rate, and you want to be able to aggregate those things together.
Yeah, so as we discussed, the backend.update makes the backend update things in order. So the states and the events together have to both be updated and raised in order. So yeah, you can determine whether something was pressed twice in between frames. If the space bar, say, was pressed 10 times, like up and down 10 times in between two updates, two backend updates, then yeah, you can still see that through events, even though the net change on the device state will be none. Does that answer the question?
Right. I understood that you said it was supported, but it's kind of hard to conceptualize what that would look like. Is all I'm trying to say. And so I think in the proposal doc here, it'd be helpful to see some samples showing these kind of scenarios that a user may want to do and how it used to look like, minimally versus what it would have to look like with the updated API.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense.
I don't think it changes all that much if you're using the input context. If you really want to be able to get any input events and stuff as quickly as they happen, like for example, if you in the current 2.0 system using the GLFW backend, at least I remember I tested, if you subscribe to an input event and have a very slow update rate, you still get events in between the updates. If you add input context.update somewhere in the middle of your update loop, even though your game's update isn't getting called, then you can still do that. You can still get events happening at nearly any time.
Yeah, and on the whole slow frame thing, you could certainly keep track. I don't know, using like an integer in your game, like that is set to 1 or 0 repeatedly for frames. You could sort of determine in your callback what frame you're on. It's certainly something you could do from a user perspective, but I agree we could probably do with updating the proposal with an example of that. Because you're absolutely right, slow frames could cause a problem, especially with input.
How would multi-threading work here? Is it allowed or disallowed to, for example,
So that's actually a
input
problem
update?
with the backends, because for example, GLFW does not allow for poll events to be called in a thread that it was not created in. So threading can be a wait, what did I say? GLFW does not allow GLFW poll events to be called in another thread that's not the one that called init. So threading can be restricted by the backend.
Okay.
Let's see, the proposal does say something. Threading rules for the reference implementation will be explicitly documented, and guidance for using this type safely against any first-party implementations will be included in the XML user implementation. It also says the user is responsible for respecting threading rules regarding the backends.
Cool. Well, all right. So where were we? We had joystick input to go. I think.
You want to take a look at joystick input? I just glanced over it because it was not something very important. Like if you've seen the 2.0 API, it's basically the same thing, just with the changes we already saw. Like instead of having the state on the interface itself, it's on the state struct.
Yeah, fair enough. That sort of covers it. I mean, it's basically a gamepad, but just like sort of you can have as many buttons as you want, or you can have
Yeah.
it's sort of a weird mishmash of it. You could have multiple axes rather than just yeah, it's something a bit more flexible than the gamepad API, which is sort of geared towards oh, it's a thing you hold in your hand, and it has an explicit structure. So I guess we should probably just double check on the last meeting notes. Now, it's probably most of these don't really. Yeah, these don't really make sense anymore because the input proposal has changed so much since our last review. Primarily because it was this make input state structs immutable, and have a state read-only property, which we've implemented in this proposal, and it resulted in the entire proposal changing around it. But I think we've rectified the comments that we came that came from the last meeting. And one of the comment from the last meeting as well was we should document the change and sort of put together a migration guide for the new input. And I suppose Tanner's comments about putting some examples together would feed into that as well. But yeah, I think we've covered the comments there.
Yeah, maybe you could actually show the examples. I just went over them and started explaining the other things, but maybe some people are actually interested in the usage examples at the top of the proposal.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these aren't the most specific in the world. They just sort of show what a typical usage for moving a gamepad thumbstick would be. I mean, to go back to Tanner's, you can pick up a gamepad or a keyboard and mouse or whatever. For example, you could have like a I don't know, like a boolean or an enum here, an enum local there, and you could use that in your surface in your actual rendering code to, for example, determine what button images you actually render on screen, based on whether it was a gamepad or a keyboard or a button or a mouse button that was pressed last. Because you can receive all simultaneously. It's just what you do with that. But yeah, these are just some basic input examples. We should probably put some specific ones as part of the documentation after we've implemented this.
Yeah, I think in particular one of the things of note is there's a lot of engines that are actually moving away from the explicitly subscribe a what is effectively an event to a particular key, and instead they're moving towards kind of an inverse model where you have an action you want to perform, such as jump, and then that gets bound to multiple devices effectively, and whether and there's kind of this weird inverse mapping between the user wants to jump, was the input the corresponding jump, whether that's space or A or X or something else, and then just like kind of there's a weird inverse mapping there to make it work and nice for the user to conceptualize rather than needing to explicitly codify multiple subscription events everywhere. And I don't think that would change this API, but it would be a potential thing you would build on top of this kind of API.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, especially with like the recent Unity changes as well. They're moving towards that model. I've seen, and you said it exactly. It's the sort of thing we could build on top of this API. I mean, this one sort of focused on exposing what we receive from the native backend and sort of sprucing it up a little.
Right.
Whereas, yeah, you said that we could build an input actions API on top of it. To be honest, that would be a great suggestion for future expansion.
I think the only other thing of note is the enums are particularly for the joypad, they're potentially opinionated on the names. Like it explicitly codifies A, B, X, Y and stuff. Whereas, of course, if you're using a PlayStation controller, you're going to have a X square, circle, triangle. Or if you're differentiating between like a Switch Pro controller or an Xbox controller, what is A versus B differs. The total set of buttons here is also kind of limited, and depending on what controller you have, you may have many more. For example, if you're using an Xbox Elite controller, you actually have 5 or 6 additional buttons on top of these. And so I wonder if having an enum of exact values of named values like this is the necessarily right approach, versus potentially a different model where you have effectively registered atoms representing each potential button that is available, and effectively giving them a known ID, but not necessarily tying them strictly to a this is A, this is B, etc.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right on the opinionated thing. Is that, yeah, we've just sort of gone with the names. We've sort of gone with GLFW on this. If we've just done ABXY, I know we've aliased some things elsewhere in the other enums, where we've sort of we could probably do something like like circle equals A or whatever, to sort of solve the opinionated names. But you're right on the actual buttons. Well, first of all, we're sort of restricted on what the backend gives us, but to be honest, we shouldn't. That's not a good reason to influence the API design, in my opinion. So I suppose we could look into something like the like what we've done for keyboards, is where you can have named keys that we've officially assigned a name to, and then you could also get like some sort of scan code. I mean, I'd need to look into how it actually works natively, but yeah, we could move towards something like having a joystick button struct, and then you've got joystick button name if it's a named key, but that might be unknown, and then you've got the number of it, and then the downstream user still has some way of receiving those input events, even if we don't necessarily support it in the library itself.
Right.
So yeah, I suppose we could. Well, I don't know. What does everyone else think? Do you how should we proceed? Should we revise the proposal to sort of use that have a struct that has a name or something else like an integer? It's similar to what we've done with keyboards, or should we just leave it for now and potentially expand it in I don't know, another interface with another kind of state? I don't know. What's everyone think?
I don't think that having an integer that, like a scan code, is any different from having an enum, right? Like we've just, like if we just add like a bunch of integers now for like, like the like dual shock controllers, right? And like that's kind of just the same sort of buttons, but just named differently. So our enum names here are opinionated, sort of, but I don't think it helps if we just make them not named at all. So I think we could think about like renaming them or finding better names or just introducing multiple names for the same integers represented by the enum. But I don't think kind of going back to the less usable just use integers approach is that helpful.
On control, you can go.
I was just going to say, for reference, I wasn't saying like go strictly to a model where you only have integers, but rather there are going to be nuances even with the named approach of the enum, where the named things are simpler but also potentially just as confusing. And it's possible that some of that just needs to be fixed up on the back end, but the most trivial example is that if you look at the Nintendo controllers versus the Xbox controllers, A and B and X and Y are swapped, and so if you're saying, if a user is saying that if A is A on the Xbox controller and it's X on the PlayStation controller, you're going to have a user that's implementing the switch that's either going to that's implementing some code that works with the Pro controller, that's either going to assume that A means A, in which case it's the middle right button, or they're going to assume that A means the same as it does on Xbox and PlayStation, which is that it's the bottom button, and that it's positional rather than actual name.
Right. So I think the best approach, I think, is to just rename them to be positional, because I think that's what they are. I'd have to look up again with GLW, because that's where we took the values from. But I think they're just positional. And then I think we can just expose like the more nuanced stuff from the more special controllers via the joystick API. And then the gamepad would just be like a sort of more basic kind of standard controller, right? And then for all of the special stuff, you'd have to go to joystick API. I think that's how it was designed. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's how it could work. Because I think we can never accommodate like all of the controllers. So I mentioned this when we initially discussed this. I, for example, have a Steam controller and they have like a touchpad. We can never accommodate, for example, that. It's just too uncommon, and we kind of have to make some kind of opinion here, because otherwise we can just not have a usable gamepad API, right?
I feel like. Oh,
No, go ahead.
okay, yeah. I feel like gamepads and controllers, in general, the more exotic you try to support, it's just going to become a cat and mouse game. So, yeah, there has to be just a line drawn somewhere of opinionated versus practicality.
I just want to make sure we're not missing the Discord messages. Oh, everyone's in here. Oh, hello. But so yeah, we could just have like a device ID. And although at the same time we could just have another device interface for specific controllers, that if a game wants to support I don't know, like a Steam controller, in addition to the iGamepad, we could do like an iSteam controller gamepad, which has more stuff. So
I was gonna just suggest the same thing. Like when you think about this from the keyboard perspective, you've got people from every country, and although most keyboard layouts are somewhat similar, the actual scan codes mapping to keys don't line up. And so if you really need to, you can go down to and get the individual scan codes and deal with that. But most users deal with the key codes instead. And so you could provide something where you've got the base, basically abstract, integer identified buttons and input controls, along with an API that's built on top of that allows you to query what does this button represent for the low level side, and then on the high level side you could have something like, oh, here's an Xbox controller, a Pro controller, a Switch controller, and a Steam controller, because those are likely the most popular four. And for those, you can provide a nicer abstraction on top involving effectively button codes that give you, here's triangle or here's Y.
So essentially splitting it up from in between a high and low level, or higher level and lower level kind of controller API. That one provides more features, and the other's more flexible. Is that what I'm understanding? Sorry,
Yeah, kind of. That's already how Windows and Mac and Linux all expose their keyboard and mice support. It's also it's functionally what's already there for the keyboard side, so that you can support the different keyboard layouts and things like that. So it would just be extending that to effectively the controllers and gamepads as well. That way, users have a nice and easy to use API for the common case. But if they have some need to support more esoteric features, like they want to support touchpads, because Steam controller provides an SDK for that, then you can actually go and add that support. You just have to do some additional work to use the more low level API instead.
I can't remember.
I think the problem is that there's no, at least I don't know of any like standardized way of addressing all of the buttons. And then also there's kind of difficult to say where this like starts and ends, right? So, we might want to like expose all of the buttons, but then like if we go to there and we want to expose all the low level features, then we also want to expose all of the like motors, and then we might also want to expose like all of the lights, maybe, right? You want to, I don't know, I think some of the PlayStation controllers have like the light system, right? And so we would also want to support that at like the low level, and then I think it becomes increasingly difficult to really tell what we want to support and what we can't support. And then also this comes down to just what do the backends, what are they able to do, right? I don't think GLFW has, for example, support for lighting of the controller, right? So I think we can't, or we don't want to expose a really like low level gamepad API, because if you want to go there, you should probably just go for dedicated like API there. So, like for example, if you want to use all of the features of like the DualShock controllers, then use the SDK they made, and then you get all of the features, and we just kind of provide you with like the this works most of the time. You will be fine with what we provide you, because I don't think we can ever accommodate all of the vendor specific like low level things.
Yeah, and I suppose well, for those cases, like for example, we had the we have alluded to possibly having an OpenXR based input backend. So I suppose for those cases, I think the Steam controller is probably our best example. They have a dedicated SDK for actually using that. We could implement an input backend, another input backend, using the Steam controller SDK, that you can then plug into an input context and receive events for both Steam controllers and other controllers as well. So I think the beauty of this proposal is that we could easily tack on something, whether it be another interface or something else entirely. We could implement something on top of this that is more specific and has support for more buttons, more like touchpads, some lights, whatever else.
For what it's worth, I do think that you're potentially overestimating how complex the low level API is or needs to be. Basically, every operating system exposes this as here's the raw PCI device ID, and here's a byte array of the data as well as which HID input it came from. There's a well-defined standard for getting input data from controllers. And it's just generic data until you build something on top of it. And so the low-level API is actually really primitive because you're just returning an ID, which corresponds to some actual encoded hardware information and the raw byte data that the device returned. Then on top of that, that allows a user who's interested in, for example, supporting a Steam controller or any other device or controller they want to interpret the relevant IDs and device data to support it. You don't
One
actually
thing
have to expose a lot of concepts to the user.
One thing I did want to touch on more specifically with Steam controller support is I believe I'm fairly certain the Steam Deck will likely be using the same SDK and API stuff, so that might be worth looking into. Not, but sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
So,
sorry.
so from what I can tell, at least I just basically did a quick Google search how other people handle this, and I think it really does come down to what Tenet said, and we could just expose sort of like a really basic, like sort of like scan codes, and that could work. So, for example, sorry.
I was just gonna say I definitely don't think it needs to be complicated, and it would just provide a building block for people who want to support their own things on top. Of course, if you're wanting to support the Steam controller, you wouldn't want to go and use the raw HID inputs. You'd want to use the SDK because that's just going to be more efficient and easier to use. But it provides an option for users who need or want to do the thing without a lot of additional work per se.
So just there, for example, there is an enum that the Windows SDK exports. Of course, is also somewhat opinionated, but the way it works for them apparently is just having a bunch, like a huge enum, which just basically duplicates. For example, there's square, and then there's also X, and apparently they do also have different IDs. So I think we could just expose this, and then also, like I personally, I'd also want to keep the current Gamepad API to just not ask every user to deal with like the tiny difference that is there between like a PS controller and like an Xbox controller.
I do think it's certainly a valid need, and it is something that we haven't really thought of. But I suppose it ultimately comes down to what we can feasibly implement. Like I know with GLFW we don't get that sort of low level information. We just sort of get what it gives us, and that the API is sort of modeled around that. Now I said that what we can actually implement isn't really an excuse for designing an abstraction in a certain way. I think we've left ourselves enough room for future expansion such that if we do get access to a cross-platform way to get that low-level input, or heck, even if it's just a Windows specific and the user adds that low-level backend, if you like, to their input context. Yeah, it is sort of awkward in that the low-level interface in that case would be coming after the high-level interface, but I think it just comes back to what we can actually feasibly do today.
It's better to get a smaller thing done now than it is to get nothing done than it is to plan a smaller or a larger thing in the works forever. So you do have to pick your battles there.
Right, so I guess we just think about this again and see if we can come up with a not too difficult way of exposing the more low level information here. And then I guess we just come back with that. Don't think we'll find like a definitive solution right now.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. I mean, yeah, it would be good to have to have that low level API and be able to sort of build on top of that. But I suppose if it's not really feasible today, and we probably don't want to spend the whole 3.0 dev cycle making it feasible, then I think I think we've left ourselves enough room for expansion to sort of add in a more low level thing later in the future, and failing that, well, we always have the next breaking update, which we haven't even thought about, but yeah, there's something we could do should a cross-platform way or a preferred way for getting access to this low-level stuff.
And
Yeah.
if cross-platform thing is a consideration, then I definitely agree that what's here today will be, it's probably what a lot of people will want to use, and it will be what most people wanting to like write their own indie game will probably end up using. And a low-level thing, instead of being built as the base, could be built as a parallel. Like you could imagine you've got iGamepad device, I think it was called, and then HID device. Although I think that's wrong because it's human input device, but you could imagine a parallel interface for those types of low-level building blocks, and so you wouldn't have to block or anything.
I don't know much about how controllers function on the low-level side. Is there any sort of common device like ID or identifier that they have, or is it all just kind of a mess from that perspective?
So the way PCI works is that every single manufacturer, per se, I believe the technical term is vendor, is able to go and register themselves with PCI and get an ID allocated to them. That is regularly updated as part of a global registry that lists what IDs correspond to what company. So there's one specifically for AMD, one for Microsoft, one for Nintendo, one for Sony, etc. Then within that vendor space, every single device gets an ID, and a vendor is allowed to allocate their IDs however they want.
So it's similar to a MAC address in that the first half is dedicated to the vendor and the second is dedicated to the ID itself.
Yeah, kind of. And so whenever you like, if you plug an Xbox controller in, the actual X input SDK is actually just effectively using the raw input stuff on the back end, and it's saying, I'm listening for events from vendor ID X and then device ID Y, and it aggregates those events together, gets the raw byte data, and then publishes it to the end user as a friendlier API. There is a bit of nuance there because they're using more efficient ways to do it than the actual raw input API itself, but that's effectively how it works.
As a temporary solution to cover kind of what you discussed earlier about a potential inability to determine like photos or input positions, could we expose at least that vendor ID to the end user either in raw form or as just common vendor enums to mitigate that for now, while until a better solution is found?
So I did, while you were speaking, I did have a look at this, and it looks like GLFW doesn't have a way to do this today. However, I don't see why we couldn't add our own support on top of GLFW. To do, well, as in like modify GLFW itself, as we've got some other things that we want to change. So it is possible that if we submitted a patch to GLFW, it should be a pretty trivial thing to add. Yeah, it's just we got to work up the layers a bit with that one.
Okay. Sorry, my bad.
Don't stop apologizing. That's an excellent question. Also, that wasn't me being mad. Just to clarify. But yeah,
It's fine.
Thank you for
rather
your
new
input.
to this. I'm rather new to this. This is like my first actual meeting that I've attended, so kind of unfamiliar with this format.
No worries.
And-
We're all sort of winging it.
Notably, the same vendor and device information is exposed by Vulkan, by DirectX, technically by OpenGL, although it's a pain to get. And then the same for any audio device or basically any other hardware device that you have access to in your computer. There's all these same two vendor and device IDs.
We've got some love for Red Hacker in the chat. In the YouTube chat, sorry.
That's nice, I suppose. Not sure how to feel about that, but okay.
Okay. So, does anyone have any other questions going on?
Not at the moment. I don't, at least.
Awesome. I haven't seen anything pop through in the chat, but in the YouTube chat. But if you do, then speak now. Okay. I think we should be good to move on. We've got a quick question before we move on Web GPU. Is it planned for 3.0? Yes, it's just a low priority item, primarily because it's a big thing.
Isn't there some technical blocker for that? I don't remember.
So
There are many.
There's some issues with Blazor, but the 3.0 architecture sort of helps a bit with that. We have stuff we need to figure out. Primarily, it's because we want to design a binding that will work using both WebGPU native and WebGPU in the browser. So it's certainly possible. We'll just need to figure out how to do it from a generator perspective. But it is something we are keen to get in, and we will be investigating it at the very least for 3.0. But it is a low priority item, so no promises, but of the low priority items, it's the most likely to get in. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so speaking of the generator, Kai, we're on to your bit now. So for those of you unfamiliar, we've got Silk Touch is a name of a source generator in 2.x. And in 3.0, we're sort of building out Silk Touch a bit more to sort of be like a full generator stack. Kai, if you want to sort of run through what we've got proposed here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'll try to kind of break it down a little bit to not get into too many of the details. So basically, the main goal of this kind of redesign is to make it work sort of independently and sort of from top to bottom. So right now we have build tools which takes C and like XML files and then figures out like method signatures. And the problem right now is that it doesn't only figure out the literal method signature that that the native API declares, but it also figures out a bunch of overloads. And right now we've sort of patched in SilkTouch later to then again figure out how to go back. And that's kind of the problem. And now we just want the base tool, the scraper, which is the lowest one, to only read the native signatures and then output them. So this will work primarily using Clang Sharp and a special tool that outputs XML from the Invoke generator, and then with a little bit of support from the XML files Kronos gives us. But the main source will be the C headers. And then that one will basically work on its own. And it only outputs the literal native signature. So if Vulkan says this API takes a void pointer, then this will output a void pointer, and that's it. And then on top of that, we have the emitter. And the emitter is basically responsible for actually calling the method. So this does no marshalling, it only does the literal call. So for the simple one, so glfw, it'll just emit DLL imports. And for some of the more complicated ones like Vulkan, it'll use the different Vulkan loading functions. And this is all detailed here. There are different attributes that we can use to modify this behavior. There is support for DLL import, which is the primary one we want to use wherever possible. There is the support for static linking, which is important on like iOS where this is necessary. And then there's also support for expression-based loading, which is important for Vulkan and some other sources. And this should be very flexible, as it like you can specify it at the type level, you can specify it at the individual function level. It should be extremely flexible and it should also hopefully keep the component pretty simple, comparable to what SilkTouch is now. So after we've done both the stages, we'll have just the raw native calls. So using just these two, you can call any function that we bind to. So any Vulkan function, any GL function, any GLFW function, any OpenCL function, etc., but only using the literal native type. So, well, if there's a void pointer, you have to provide a void pointer, and that's it. If the API wants a string, you have to do the marshalling, and yeah. And then the last bit, which is the one that really makes Silk.net, is the overloader, and this tries its best to, based on metadata we figured from the C header and from the XML files, tries its best to make things nicer. So often, I think the best example here is strings. Often we will have just a raw pointer that the API wants, and as a user you have no idea how to get this or how to make that work. And using the metadata, we can figure out, this is supposed to be string in UTF-8 format, and I don't know, it should be null terminated, right? And then we can generate the marshalling code to make a C# string into this pointer and make it the right format. And pretty much all users know how to get a string, right? So this is really the complicated part, but also it should be much easier now that it only needs to figure out the C#ified type and no longer all of the marshalling steps, because once we know this void pointer is a string, we also know the marshalling steps, right? So it's much simpler, and again, this works on its own. So theoretically, if you are slightly crazy and you like to write your C# code like it's C, you can use this to make your library look nice as well. I don't personally would recommend it probably, but it should work on its own, and it should
Slightly crazy.
and it should work really well on its own. It shouldn't require either the emitter or the scraper to work. Then there's a list of the proposed APIs. Some of these are, or most of these are completely new. So the first couple ones are just for modifying of the emitter. Some of these are also old. So for example, native API, we know that one. It's an attribute now, but it holds the same sort of information, just as an attribute instead of a base class. And one important thing is also that we now support proper calling conventions. Before we technically had support for all of these calling conventions, and it usually works pretty well. But now we have actual support for all of them, and I hope that this should cover us in all cases. One thing to note here is this does not include any capabilities that we don't already have. So this is just how would we build the current Silk Touch if we had to rebuild it now and could do everything from scratch. So this should pretty much bring the library to the point it is right now. So everything should look the same or slightly better than it is right now. And then, as mentioned before, things like WebGPU can be built on top of this. But for example, you will see there is no WASM or JavaScript call modifier listed here right now, because it's not this isn't really extending our capabilities. It's just making the architecture proper and thought out and helps build future extensions.
Okay, and I imagine that this new single tool does a job very well approach would have good implications for maintainability in the future, because I think you did mention that the current Silk Touch is kind of all is kind of one thing. I imagine that makes it rather difficult to maintain at times.
Yeah, Silk Touch is very complicated and has a lot of sort of old code bits that we needed and then later realized we don't actually need. So, for example, 1 or 2 weeks ago, we had someone on the Discord ask about this error they got when they tried to use Silk Touch themselves, and it threw an exception, something like vtable is forced or something, and I wrote the code. I still had to go digging, what does this mean? When does this happen? And hopefully things like that never happen here, because in theory, all of these tasks are very simple, and we can just focus on making one, and then also we can hopefully properly test this. So at least the minimum thing for all of these 3 stages is having some basic integration tests. So, make each of the attributes at least test a small snippet that it works, and do that on every commit so it doesn't break easily. And right now we have none of that. So Silk Touch and Build Tools both are just kind of chugging along, and we don't really know that they work before we commit. So that should also have a lot with maintainability to just have at least basic integration tests. I hope to, especially with the overloader, have detailed unit tests, but the bare minimum for 3.0 is having basic integration tests for each one of these.
Yes, it's been 3 years and we've forgotten what all of our code does in the generator. So,
That's not a good thing.
yeah, we're sort of hanging in there at this point. We've had a question in the Discord chat about why are we using the call modifiers enum when we could be using the standard unmanaged calling convention attribute.
So it's a bit complicated. We could probably make the standard ones work somehow, but there's two problems with them. One is they are types, so we can't we'd have to keep around a list of types. That's kind of weird. And then also we don't have control over those. So if we ever, for example, if we ever wanted to make a JavaScript calling convention, right? Doesn't really make sense, but that's a possible goal of this. That we have the capability to call into, for example, an IJS runtime, right? And that's just not possible if we rely on some predefined types. Of course, then we could define our own type, but it doesn't really. I don't think it does anything for us. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't help with anything, and it probably only complicates the code for no real reason. It's not like we would get automatic support for the new calling convention, right? If .NET ever added support for, I don't know, Risk V, and they had a separate calling convention, it's not like we would get automatic support. We'd still have to add the support, just now via reflection APIs and via a bunch of code that handles these types, and it doesn't I don't personally see whether it does anything to help us if we use the predefined types.
Sorry, I'm not understanding that statement there. I don't see how you can support a new calling convention without the runtime supporting it in the first place.
Well, so for example, Risk V, we of course can't do anything about that, but we can support sort of a pseudo calling convention like JS, right? So calling to JS as a native interrupt sort of is perfectly a perfectly valid use case, and there's no reason why the runtime would ever have that as a calling convention, because it isn't a native calling convention, but it can still make sense for us.
That would just be like WebAssembly, in which case that's platform default.
I'm not sure what you mean. Yeah, and in WebAssembly, yeah, we can just call there we still use the URL import, right? But if you look at calling to some WebGL functions directly, you can't really do that from WASM, at least not in my testing. And so you'd either have to go to use the in-browser JS runtime, so calling the JS functions, and that'd be a possibility. And then I don't see the benefit of using the runtime types.
I think another
Is there
thing.
any I'm missing?
I think
The main benefit.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Perksy.
I think one thing is that this isn't necessarily calling convention in the strict sense. I mean, it's the reason we called it call modifiers and not calling convention. So member function is probably a good example. I mean, while that has runtime support now, before we could easily implement that atop the base calling convention. And the JavaScript thing is another good example. Is that while if we had a JavaScript call modifier, it might not necessarily change the calling convention, but it will influence how we generate code. And I think, well, in my opinion, this enum sort of represents sort of a code gen control sort of thing, referring to how SilkTouch outputs its code essentially.
It's worth noting that member function is a calling convention. It is very specifically a calling convention, and the ability to effectively hack it up was a side effect of knowing and understanding the Windows ABI and having an equivalent way to define it in C# that happened to work. It is still 100% dependent on the runtime and a number of other features having that work correctly. There are other cases of conventions where you literally cannot hack it up. Vector call is a good example. There is no way to hack that up without runtime support. JavaScript calling into JavaScript would likewise be a scenario where you might be able to hack it up on a given platform, but on another platform, you might not be able to do it at all because you may have platforms like RISC-V or Long Arc where the sign of the type actually matters. It's dependent on the ABI, and so um, you can't just hack up something if the underlying runtime doesn't correctly support that.
So to explain what's meant with the JS interrupt, for example, that's not like a literal native calling convention. What I mean with that is in Blazor, in Blazor WebAssembly, you get access to a type, I think it's called IJS in process runtime, and it effectively gives you just a very simple method. It's called like invoke or something, and you can just call like a named JS export, right? So WebGL exports all of their functions like as a JS function, so you could usually call them from JS, and then you can do the same from C# using this function. And so what we could do, probably won't, but could do, is support using this IJS in process interface to call into JavaScript functions from the code generator. So instead of like generating a DLL import and calling that, we would then ask for an instance of this interface in the constructor and then call into the invoke function. So it's not like a literal like API based interrupt. Some of these are, of course, like CDL convention is of course like an API thing, but this could support other scenarios that aren't like API dependent or like hardware dependent.
That seems like a so to me that seems like a different thing. So that's basically the same as Objective C, where there's not where it's just the C ABI. It's the platform default ABI, but in order to call anything, you have to go through obc message send, and similar functions like that. And to me, at least, the kind of better thing to do here is you would have two distinct things. On one hand, you'd use unmanaged call conv and type of, and the benefit of that is that you don't have to understand it. All you have to do is take that and blit it out to the equivalent uh on the corresponding DLL import or other scenario that you're generating, whether it's function pointers, DLL imports, etc. You don't have to understand it. You literally just blit it out. And then you have a different concept of here's potentially some other support that's irrespective of the calling convention. And that's saying this happens to be defined in JavaScript or Objective-C or Swift or Java itself. And then that allows the code generator to go and insert the additional handlers on top of it to make it work, irrespective of any kind of calling convention. They are kind of orthogonal concepts.
Right. So I actually think you're sort of right. The problem is that the call motive, like I think you're sort of right that it makes more sense to separate these because the calling convention, so the literal like the CDCL or SCD call, these are sort of associated with DLL import and like that kind of side of the calling process, and then things like potentially like a JavaScript calling convention that's not actually concerned with modifying the behavior of the DLL import or whatever. They are just kind of separate concepts. So it actually sort of makes sense, but it's difficult to represent right now because we have the native API attribute. And let me just quickly see. Percy, can you find an example? Do we have an example in the document about?
What,
I
the
think
attribute itself or a
yeah, of
usage
the
of it?
attribute usage.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we have one there. Just let the stream catch up.
Yeah, there we kind of see. So the way it works is that you would have specified the calling convention on the method, and I have to actually say that doesn't necessarily make sense. So we should probably change that to be called something else, because it does influence only the DLL import, so only use static library or use dynamic library, and doesn't. Yeah, so we probably have to kind of change the name of the attribute, and then it's probably a worthwhile suggestion to look at using the types instead. So we could probably write that down and see how we can do that. I'm not too sure whether it helps us anything though. Is there any like direct advantage of doing that over
Well,
using?
the main thing is that as the runtime versions in the future, it will continue adding more call conv types. Those call conv types, along with unmanaged call conv, are the official way moving forward to represent any type of calling convention information to the runtime. And so for anything that you have here as a call modifier, you're going to have to go and translate that to either the attribute or the inline syntax for putting them in a function pointer. So you're fundamentally going to have this mapping and this understanding of those attributes anyways, unless you just have the types, in which case you can blit them as is. You don't have to understand what the type is. You just have to basically have an import for system runtime compiler services, and then just put, suppress GC transition, member function, cdecl, etc. In the same way, WinAPI is actually not a calling convention. It's the default. So you're essentially saying WinAPI here, but that's the equivalent of just saying unmanaged, or not specifying anything.
So yeah, I think that makes sense. Only question I had, is it in generally like specified that any type that's allowed on like a function pointer declaration is also allowed to be passed into a DLL import? So for example, is it legal to pass the suppress GC transition type? Like I think there's a type for that as well that you can put in the function pointer. Is it also legal to give that as a like in the calling convention array to DLL import, or do we still have to do some filtering and would have to do the mapping anyways?
So the way it works is that DLL import, it takes the calling convention enum, and if it's one of the 4 or 5 well-defined conventions, meaning this call, standard call, fast call, or cdecl, that has an existing well-defined value, then you use that. That's all you use. If it's anything else, so if you have suppressed GC transition, if you have member function, if you have any of this other info that goes on top of it, then you have to use the new bit that's been allocated, that enum, and add the unmanaged call conf attribute in addition with the appropriate type of sequence.
Right, so we basically would it be legal to just always specify the unmanaged call confs and then just like if for example if you would just want to use like CDCL, would it be legal to not specify it as a calling convention, instead use the unmanaged calling convention attribute?
I believe technically yes, but you wouldn't want to due to DLL bloat.
Right, so we basically end up doing the mapping anyways.
Well, you do a mapping for the 4 well-defined conventions that have existed since .NET 1.0,
Right,
and then for anything else, you don't have to care about it.
We'd also probably prefer using the suppressed GC transition attribute, like the normal attribute, over using the new type, right?
That one doesn't matter. There's not going to be any real DLL bloat either way there. The difference is that the DLL import attribute is not a real attribute. It's effectively magic that gets compiled down to direct and inline bit flags in the metadata. Whereas any type of user attribute is encoded differently, and once you're using user-defined attribute, you don't really have to care about how much space it's taking anymore.
Right, so I think then it's fine. Then we can probably rename I think we should then probably split the native API attribute into, I don't know, like an entry point attribute. I'm bad at naming. So that the string that also goes on there is provided differently. And then we need like a different attribute that effectively modifies the function pointer or the DLL import. And that only works in cases where the emitter has already decided to use a function pointer or DLL import. So in case of a function pointer, it would just put the different types inside the function pointer declaration. And in case of DLL import, it figured out the calling convention and put the unmanaged calling convention in the separate attribute. And so we probably want to then split up that attribute. But that shouldn't be too big of a change.
Yeah, and I suppose we could just change modifiers to be a type array as well, and take those typological
That'd be a plan.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way forward. I shall add that to the notes. All right, so is there any other questions on that?
Unfortunately, I don't know much about this area, so no, I don't really know much of what you were saying. So I don't have any input, unfortunately.
Yeah,
No
same
worries.
here. In one ear, right out the other.
Yeah, no worries, and it looks like we got nothing from the YouTube chat as well. So I think we should. Well, first of all, I think we should probably circle back to the original comments from this. They mostly surrounded around. We weren't sure what we wanted to do with our overloads because in 2.x, we sort of we try to generate every single permutation of overload that we think could be possibly useful to the user. This has resulted in us having I think our record that we found was like over 150 overloads for a single function. So a lot of these comments here were around what should we do? Should we promote the best practice? Should we be opinionated, etc., etc. How we've essentially solved this in this proposal is by not solving it. We'd like to essentially have a play around and experiment with a number of different things, and then circling back to a community meeting with our findings, essentially having a proper plan for how we're going to tackle this, because we did try discussing a formal way, like a formal overloading plan, but ultimately we've just got to have a play around with it once we're actually implementing, and then circle back to the community meeting and present our findings, essentially.
Yeah, and we also, I think just today we talked about just different solutions. That way we could also sort of offload this decision to a user. So yeah, I don't think we need to solve this either. So
Well,
yeah, I think
we need to solve this, but just not today.
Yeah, and also I think it's not clear whether we will actually end up like having priorities or like I don't think there's any clear indication how this will work.
I definitely do. I definitely will say it does need to be solved eventually. That some of the functions in there have quite a long list of overloads, and it's rather difficult to sort through some of the ones you need, especially in async.
Right, so I think just just a quick thought in this is, on one hand, we want to scrap a bunch of the current overloads. So, for example, right now we have some overloads that take like arrays, or we have some that take like refs where it's just unnecessary. So a lot of this is only like generating the couple of actually important overloads and scrapping a bunch of the others. And then also I think, especially in SM, the in overload has crept in a lot, and that will also be scrapped completely. So I hope that by the time we are at a stage where we can actually like look at how much do we generate now, it'll be less of a problem, and then we'll also find a solution much easier. Because right now, from the overloads we have right now, it's extremely difficult to say, oh, this one is preferable over that one, because a lot of them just aren't really good either. So
Yeah, and Asimp is where we got the 150 overload record as well.
I figured. Being one of the few poor saps who are actually trying to use it, yeah, I kind of figured.
Yeah, yeah, we're going. I think ultimately, what we're asking of the community is to sort of let us play around with it, figure out what is best. Because I think we're all in agreement that the 2.x situation is, while it certainly gives you a lot of options, it is a bit ridiculous. So I think what we're sort of asking is to have a play around with it, and then come back in a future community meeting and sort of present our findings a bit.
Was there any consideration for a source generator based approach, where users could opt into the friendliest variant that they want,
yes,
or the APIs they use?
so kind of. In fact, I literally had the idea on how to do this today. I thought about it for a while, but I literally had the idea to do this today. So that's why I don't have a formal like proposal. And basically, so this isn't formalized. So I don't take this with a little bit of like with a grain of salt. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks. The way I kind of thought it could work is we need to, or we want to, build the like most basic overloads into the assembly. So it just makes sense to, if you have a like a pointer argument and a count argument, to just generate a span overload. That just makes sense. And it also extremely rarely happens multiple times in one method. So it isn't really a problem in the number of overload like situation. And then for like other types, so for a bunch of the more like advanced like remapping types, right? We have a huge list of remappings that we apply right now. We kind of like to have a source generator, or have the overloader we also use be sort of productized, so users can remap types to whatever type they like, and also take out overloads they might not like. And this could, it's not like it might be a bad idea, but I think this could also mean that some of the overloads we ship today would then become optional and just kind of be the default configuration. So one pretty obvious thought there is our current math library, right? I think it's pretty good, but I'm very certain that someone can do a better job at it. And so someone eventually might want to opt out of having all of these overloads with our math library. So there, it could make sense to make it optional, especially because they generate quite a lot of overloads. So yeah, having a source generator based approach certainly makes sense. We just have to figure out a way to do it efficiently and do it in a way that it doesn't incur huge compilation times, and also in a way that is pretty beginner friendly, because we don't want to like overload someone with all of these decisions they aren't really ready to make. So again, I think that's kind of a good way to figure that out. It's just to like kind of play with it, right? We have to build the overloader regardless, and then productizing it will, I think, require some experimentation, and then eventually we can kind of come back to that and look at how we can do it and what are the capabilities, right? So I don't think that's something we can really decide like this far ahead of when we actually have the code.
Notably, there's so what I was planning on adding to Clang Sharp and what I've got a prototype branch for locally is a way to is a so of course Clang Sharp today generates fully blittable bindings, 1-to-1. And most of the time, unless you have some like Sal annotations, there isn't a way to determine whether uh, char pointer is a byte array, the equivalent of a ref byte, an in byte, an out byte, or even a UTF-8 or ASCII string. There's just no way to determine that. And so I was going to provide a way for users to provide those annotations so that a friendly overload, a single friendly overload, could be generated in addition. And then the general thought is if you have the fully blittable binding in combination with a friendly overload, you have all the context to be able to generate everything in between based on what the user has physically written in code. The downside is that it's extremely costly to do the analysis to find all of those usages and then find out what the corresponding signatures you should generate.
So I think there's kind of two problems with that. So one is if you do the analysis sort of after the user has written their code, there is no kind of support from the IDE. The user has to just write their code, and then maybe your like source generator figures it out, and maybe not. So this is sort of the approach that SilkTouch today takes, just not user facing, but like internally. And I don't feel like it's a good approach in general because it's kind of like playing the lottery, right? Like maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, and you have no way of knowing whether it does. And so I don't really think it's that great of an idea. But this is very similar to how we wanted to handle it, just like proactive matter. So, for example, we'd provide you with like we have these information from like the XML files Kronos gives that this is like a UTF-8 string, and then we provide the annotation that this is a UTF-8 string, and then you could like say, okay, then please also do map this to the little like C# string, right? Using whatever method, or like if someone eventually has come out with like a package for UTF-8 strings, then they could just say, hey, please map this to this other type, to my cool UTF-8 string, and then that also just works. And then it would light up everywhere where we have these annotations, and when you then type in your IDE, it would actually show that this is possible, versus just generating it after they kind of try to give their UTF-8s like their cool like type, and we like have to figure it out, and they have no way of knowing whether it worked other than like at compilation time when either it blows up or it just doesn't. So I don't think after like doing it after the fact works that well.
Go to the C# view in there, Perksy, rather than the IL
Yeah,
view.
the stream's just updating.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was just calling out. There's also tricks you can do like this, where if you know the right attributes to slap on the C#, you can work around the C# type system, and put optional parameters anywhere in the list, and even give things like read-only span of char optional. Give them default string values, which is otherwise impossible to express in regular C#. This only works when there's an implicit conversion from a primitive type like string or int to the target type. So in this case, there's one between string and read-only span of char, so you can make this work. And of course, you could make that string be anything. You could make it, be silk.net is awesome, and this works for that, including with C# picking the right overload. This also allows you to put optional parameters as not the last parameters in the list. So there are options here to kind of make it work nicely and limit the number of overloads you have altogether. So in this case, you actually have to give it a name. So you have to say x equals, and then you can avoid the false at the end.
You blow my mind up a little bit there. I did not know that existed.
That is, whoa. I did not know you could do that with C#.
Technically, it's non-spec C#. It's a side effect of how the metadata is represented and interpreted by the compiler. But optional parameters are actually embedded using the optional attribute in the default parameter value attribute, which get compiled down to the inline attributes in IL. They're also magic attributes, as it were.
Awesome. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we've got to play with. I still think, or at least from a Silk.net perspective, a maintainers team perspective, that I think realistically we're just going to have to sort of prototype all these ideas and see what sticks. Because there's a lot of things to do and we really want to do it right, and I think we'll be, especially for something like the overloader, we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot if we sort of specify something without actually having gone and implemented it. So this will, I think, this will be something we come back to in a future community meeting. But I think for now,
I imagine we'll be coming back through this probably a couple of times.
yes, probably, because we really want to get it right. But yeah, I think as long as we can get the rest of the proposal as it currently stands in, and just have a little provision on that overloading stuff, that we will come back to this, then I think that's what we want to get out of this today.
That seems fair enough to me.
Awesome. So I'm just going to put some notes on the pull request. I also didn't put the input notes. Where did we land on input? Did we say? Did we essentially say it's approved, but we've got lots of stuff to think about in the future? Oh, and the multiple names in the enum.
Yeah, as well as potentially modifying GLFW for something. I think it was getting vendor IDs or something to I don't quite remember on that front.
Nah, that's fine. I've written it down. Yeah. Yeah, it's getting the vendor and device IDs. That should be something that should be pretty trivial to get out of GLFW. But yeah, is it safe to say that this is sort of approved though? Like there's no heavy objections as long as if we consider adding like the aliases for the enums, like I don't know, circle, square, whatever. Oh wait, no, it wasn't that. It was make it less opinionated. It was make the directional buttons directional.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. I have no objections to that myself.
I don't really object either.
I think Tanner Gooding was the one who was most upfront about his opinion on the on the controller API or on the gamepad APIs, and he doesn't seem to have an objection either.
To clarify, I have an opinion. It's not a super strong opinion, even if it might have sounded like that. I'm completely fine with it not being blocking or anything. I just wanted to raise it as a potential consideration.
Yeah, I think it's I think the whole directional button thing, that is I fully agree with that, because, well, yeah, especially the Nintendo example as well. I didn't realize that was a thing. So that's very good to think about. So yeah, rename the positional buttons, and we've got plenty to think about in the future for future expansions. But other than that, are we all good for that to essentially be approved?
Yeah.
Awesome. Right, post that, and I shall paste my notes for the Silk Touch as well. But I think it's safe to say approved, but under the overload permission. But we come back to the overload.
Bit too early to be deciding on it yet, because I don't think anyone's aware of a perfect rule as to how to generate them. Or, yeah, what overloads to keep, what not to keep. So yeah, we'll have to work on that later.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So I think that is everything for this, unless anyone has any general comments about 3.0, anything we should be considering, anything, any of your questions that we haven't covered. This is your last chance to sort of raise questions on anything 3.0. Let us know in the YouTube chat, in, well, seemingly any of the Discord channels, as we're sort of watching all of them.
So is 3.0 dropping everything but 6?
Yes, it's .NET
yeah.
6 exclusively.
Okay. Then the question is, for the SIMD APIs, is there a plan to fix them up to take advantage of the better inlining heuristics and to solve some of the other issues I had called out in the I don't remember which channel it was.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
It's eventually going to happen together with the change to use different method names for approximate and non-approximate and like exact math methods. I can't like tell you how exactly they'll look, but with .NET we'll probably just reevaluate like all of the functions, look at the ASM output, and then see how it looks, I guess. So yeah, we'll definitely like revisit that.
Yeah, because I just wanted to check, since I've been looking at a lot of that lately as part of the user-defined SIMD work I've been trying to prototype.
One thing I did want to mention, so because I took a look at the software development plan a week or a couple of weeks ago, and I did, and since we brought up a couple of things that we're gonna have to meet back in later, I was going to question, so should should the decision on what to do with overloads and, for instance, those for instance, well, yeah, I guess mainly what to do for overloads. So that should probably be done between 3 and 4, correct? Because if I remember right, 3 is the last one that's not considered production ready.
Yes, I would say it would have to be done before Preview 4, unless something goes absolutely horribly wrong.
I mean, preferably even like before 3, probably, because it's quite a fundamental change and it's bound to introduce some bugs somewhere. So, but yeah, I think we have enough space there to make that work.
Yep, no objections from me there. Okay, so I've got nothing in the YouTube chat, so if that's everything, then I think we've covered pretty much all of it. So I'll carry on watching for questions, but all in all, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for watching. It's finally good to finally get 3.0 off the ground. I really believe that we can make this the best the best .NET bindings library that we possibly can. And yeah, just really excited to finally be able to get working this, and happy that no one has any massive objections to what we've done here, like oh, you're doing it all wrong. So that's really good. As always, follow our progress in the Discord server. We're there far too often, so pop by and say hello. Likewise, you can use the GitHub discussions using our GitHub link, and yeah, you can reach us on Twitter as well. We're there now as well at silk.net. Or we have our individual Twitters, which you can find somewhere, I believe, in the silk.net readme. So yeah, all in all, lots of ways to contact us. Let us know if you have any other thoughts outside of this stream. I will probably watch the comments as well, the YouTube comments, once the VOD goes live. So yeah, thank you all, everyone, for coming. I think it's been a very good meeting, and very excited to finally get 3.0 off the ground. Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite uncommon to not see you or Kai at the Discord server, isn't it? Like, usually one of you two is on.
Yeah. No,
At least.
maybe we should take
Which
up
is
a
surprising,
hobby.
given we're both in the EU technically. So
Yeah, but Kai, your sleeping pattern is a lot worse than mine.
I have
I have
school,
to
so I
get
don't
up and
need to
go
sleep.
to I have to get up and go into an office sometimes. So yeah, I have the curse of a 9 to 5.
Guess I've got one more question that came to mind.
Oh, excellent.
What is the plan for .NET 7? And have either of you looked at generic math yet? Or are planning to look at generic math and ensure that what I've designed and am designing is in the correct shape to work for Silk moving forward?
So I haven't like explicitly looked at it's like in the correct shape, but in general, like it looked very good. Um, I think it's very difficult to say how how interested we are necessarily in like the operations part of it, because most of like the binding stuff is just concerned with give me something with a number. And so I think it'll only be like really helpful for us once we see like the system of math types also start using that. So like once there are like generic vectors, right, then it becomes really interesting for us, because then we can start replacing them in the bindings. And I probably have missed it, or maybe there are just none. I don't think there have been any plans so far to do that. So I don't think it's right now we can do anything more than just replace Scalar eventually.
Yeah, there's no. I mean, if we're mainly going with we update silk.net to exclusively support every latest LTS. So when we do support .NET 7, it will be in addition to our exclusive .NET. Well, I say exclusive. It will be in addition to our .NET 6 baseline. So it might be that we implement the addable interfaces and all the generic math interfaces for our math types, and likewise it might be
Oh, for sure.
that we implement the that we implement our methods on top of generic maths. So there's lots of things to be done there, and it's definitely in the cards.
Yeah, it wasn't mostly a question of like when Silk will do it, but more like once these APIs ship, they're shipped. There's no changing them, and so there's a window here of about 4 or 5 more months where I'm able to accept input and make changes accordingly. And so if Silk does have any plans around them, doing an investigation and getting feedback on either APIs that are missing, shapes that might not quite work or make sense, and things like that would be it would have to happen within that time frame, and the sooner the better.
Right.
And so
I'll. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just quickly, I'll definitely put it on my list then to like soon see whether we can implement them. We probably can't ship it until like, well, it's in some like stable release.
Exactly.
But I'll definitely investigate how and if we can implement them then. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely not an ask to go and implement them today, but more to uh, take a look at them and make sure that if there's any egregious errors that they get called out. Because if there's something that Silk.net would like, and it's not covered until after .NET 7 ships, well, then it's effectively too late to add it for at least another year, and in some cases, ever, depending on what that change is and if it would be breaking or not. So,
Yeah.
so just like a scan and a check of like, oh, this makes sense, or this seems a bit odd, or things like that would be uh, helpful for, I think, both myself and for any potential avenues Silk may want to pursue in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for the reminder. I'll definitely check that then. Thanks.
Awesome. So yeah. Uh, yeah, that's an excellent add. I've added it to the GitHub tracker as well. Along with what was the other thing I added? To investigate fixing the Silk.net maths inlining nuances that Tanner's brought up in passing. So yeah, a lot to be getting on with. But now that we've got the 3.0 proposals all sorted, hopefully we can just crack on with it and start implementing a full rewrite of Silk.net and boldly go, I guess. So yeah, very happy that's all sorted, and thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching. And if there's no more burning questions or remarks, then yeah, I think that's it for tonight. Silence.
Just
Well,
a
I
little
guess.
side note. Oh, no, you go. Mine wasn't
No, it's fine.
really related to the meeting. It was more reminiscing about something. So no, you go.
No, really. Please go ahead. I don't have.
I was gonna say I remember cause how I first met Perksky. I want to say was in the Stride Discord server when he was when he was asking if it would be okay if he could try and port Stride to Silk.net, and he was really excited for 2 at the time. It's like, oh, 2.0 is gonna come out, and we'll wait for that, and it'll, yeah. I'm sorry.
Don't mention that. I was young and naive.
It was an awesome release. Okay.
It was, yeah. It's just we forgot to drop the tech debt.
I'm so sorry, man.
Well, yeah. It's 3.0 is going to be the best Silk.net ever, and yeah, very very excited for Silk.net. We should Silk.net's going to solve everything. Silk.net 3.0 is going to solve everything. Don't you worry. Yeah, I yeah, I appreciate we've been down this before, but given that this is a complete rewrite, I feel a lot more confident about it rather than just a lot of extra stuff that is cool tacked onto it. So yeah, if comes Silk.net 4.0, we've still got a hey, we've got this many things we hate, we don't particularly like about the library, then I don't know, I'll eat my hat and never mention it again.
Well, that's
Nope,
not
at
very
that
healthy.
point. Nope, give up. We can't do this anymore. We can't write bindings. We suck.
Yeah, we'll have to get someone else in to do it.
Yeah, we tried our best.
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you all for coming. I think with that. Boom, what a way to end. What a way to end. All right. All right.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Right. Yeah. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for the great questions. I'm turning the stream off now. Good night.
Night.
Good night.
See ya.
Bye.